terms of sport in the Australian context, we've had leagues like the NRL, the rugby league, the AFL really dominate the commercial space and ratings with men's sport in that regard, and also the Australian cricket team. But in the last decade or so, women's sport has started to really emerge, and we're talking about the Matildas in the area of soccer, and also the Australian female cricket team as well. And then we've also had new leagues established like the AFLW, which is the Australian Football League, but for women. In recent years, just in terms of the gender pay cap, for instance, the Australian Open tennis has the same prize money for both men and women.
Oh.
So we've seen the emergence of women's sport, but what we haven't seen in particular until very recently has just been this phenomenon of popularity for the Matildas. This occurred recently around the World Cup, and ratings went through the roof. And from an ethnographic point of view, I observed lots of people in my own community getting into it as households, a lot of men with daughters following the prospects of the Matildas. And we're talking about a team here that isn't even the number one. It's not like the Australian Matildas soccer team is dominating the sport globally. They're in the top 10 teams in the world. Australians have typically loved, winners. They love it when the Australian cricket team dominates all of the other teams. They love it when the Wallabies are actually beating the All Blacks, which hasn't been happening for a while. So look, the Matildas are in the top 10 and they're very competitive, but they're incredibly popular at the moment. And so there's been this discussion, this discourse emerging, which is, well, actually, the Matildas should be getting paid as much as the Socceroos. Also, marketers, companies should be getting behind the Matildas in terms of sponsorship and marketing the sport. And in fact, there's been a number of big articles written, one recently in the Financial Review in Australia, discussing that actually, marketers really should be taking advantage of this rise in popularity of women's sport in general.
I do play a lot of soccer on EA Sports, the game. I like that.
Do you play with the women's team on EA Sports?
Of course. And the Australian women's team very, very frequently, even though, like you said, they're hard. It's hard to beat England and America with the Australian women's team on EA Sports, even though I'm not the best player or anything, but it is harder, right? And so we love winners when it comes to our national sports like cricket and rugby and all that kind of stuff. We have to win those, swimming even, right? We've got to win those because they're Aussie sports. You know what I mean? They're really Australian sports. But soccer, as we know, is kind of got more imported out of Europe. It took a long time, and it's still the underdog. But interestingly, I also noticed, remember when the Australian men's team at the World Cup, the Australians really get behind that as well, to be honest, right? So even though we know we're not going to get maybe in the rounds of 16, Australians really get invested in it, even with the blokes. And I think it's the same. And you're right, the same phenomenon happened this time with the Matildas. So I think what we're seeing in the realm of soccer, which has always been the underdog sport. And so is it possible, Nick, that because soccer has always been on the cultural outer, in a sense, in Australia, that it was easier, in a sense, for women to enter that arena where it's on the cultural outer and kind of become more dominant in that arena because it wasn't already dominated by men? Do you know what I mean? Like rugby league, AFL, cricket. I know, of course, there are great women's teams in those as well, but of course, it's the emotional imprint is dominated very much by men. And of course, soccer was always men, but because it was culturally on the outer, maybe that gave it a kind of what we call in marketing white space. Maybe there was white space in soccer for, women's team to really get up there and become, to your point, equally well known and loved as the male team as far as the national soccer team is concerned, which you can't really say the same for the other sports. I don't think that the women's cricket team or the women's rugby team or the women's whatever team, AFL team is as loved as the male counterpart team, if you like. I'm not even sure if they're seen in the same way. whereas with the Matildas, most definitely am. And look, and of course, we're always looking at the business side of things. So I am, because I'm not really invested in sport that much. So I always look at sport in terms of money and business. I think the Matildas have huge sponsorship, don't they? I mean, I think you rattled off some companies before, Nick, like Commonwealth Bank, the big one, Commonwealth Bank, Nike, Qantas, right? They're big, right? They're blue. I mean, that's blue chip sponsorship, right? I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. And then, down to, okay, Rebel, get it? I kind of get it. Rebel, absolutely. But then Cadbury, Subway. So as an organization, they're drawing in money and they're clearly making money because they got sponsors, because that's what a football team is all about, right? It's drawing in money through your sponsors, through the television rights, through everything, right? Through every single conceivable mechanism. A football team costs so much money to run that it needs massive amounts of money. Look, I'm looking at these sponsors and I'm saying, wow, I mean, they must have more sponsorship than the male team, Nick. I don't know. But to your point, the female team is probably making more money as an organisation than the Australian male national team.
I think that's quite possible.
Could that be true?
Regis. Yeah, I think it's quite possible.
It's possible, isn't it?
Yeah. The issue here is that I think the Matildas are getting better support and sponsorship, and marketers and businesses are getting behind it. In fact, a lot has been written about the only thing that prevents women's sport from being successful as a marketing tool is the idea of getting behind it. That businesses need to get behind it with sponsorship. You need to get behind it as marketers. You need to create advertising. You need to create marketing events. And in fact, this is something that I want to comment in relation to sport in general, is that professional sport that people watch on TV, traditionally it used to be predominantly men that watched sport. And now we're seeing a lot of women watching sport as well. But sport has traditionally been a very highly produced product.